Control Players Unite.
Hey Control Nation, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Dr. Red. This video's presentation is the top 35 cards used in control style decks we will miss the most, in two lists from the F block. Please note that not all of these cards are strictly control, as included are a few cards that really help control with its goals. There are two lists, ladies and gentlemen, one for Pokemon and one for trainers, with one exception in the trainers list. The Pokemon list contains 5 honorable mentions and then a top 15, whereas the trainers list contains 5 honorable mentions and a top 10. We will start with the latter. Oh, and do let me know which cards you're going to miss most in the comments. And let's start with the exception to the trainers list, the Double Turbo Energy. I included it in this list because of its massive importance to the meta, but off the top 10 because I wanted the trainers list to be dignified by the title. At any rate, DTE as it is known, reduces attack damage by 20, but provides 2 colorless energy. This is crucial to control decks for setting up attacks with devastating effects, which we will see later. It was absolutely everywhere and all kinds of decks benefited from it. Next is Worker. Discard any stadium in play and draw 3 cards. This card was everywhere when it first released, but soon fell off the radar. The stadium elimination option provided an alternative to stadium bumping with another stadium, especially after all of one's stadiums were spent, and the draw 3 didn't hurt either. Next is Sharon's Care. Put one of your colorless Pokemon with any damage counters on it into your hand and all attached cards. So one could think of it as Professor Turo's scenario without the discarding effect. This card is more niche as it is limited to colorless types, but I included it because of its healing capacity. Have a Pokemon that's in danger of a KO? Pick it up, rob your opponent of a prize card or 2, and reset. Next is Lost City. Whenever a Pokemon, yours or your opponent's, is knocked out, put that Pokemon in the Lost Zone instead of the discard pile and discard all attached cards. This stadium wasn't really popular in stricter control decks because they aren't taking KOs. It's made for aggro decks in that regard, but something like aggro control Iron Thorns EX takes advantage of it quite easily. Also, the Noivern EX, Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX Wallstall takes advantage of it with Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon KOing small Pokemon like Screamtail. And because of its no return policy in the Lost Zone, it was a delight when control players could use it. Last but not least is Switch Cart. Switch your active basic Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. If you do, heal 30 damage from the Pokemon you move to your bench. This card is more for big basic aggro decks, but it can be used in similar style control decks with big basics, especially when one's benched Pokemon is gusted into the active. One can easily switch it out and get back to controlling. So with that being said, everybody, let's get into the top 10 proper. Number 10 is Roxanne. You can use this card only if your opponent has 3 or fewer prize cards remaining. Both players shuffle their hands into their decks, you draw 6 and your opponent draws 2. This card was popular on release, but whose use has since significantly dropped due to being replaced by Iono, appearing in the occasional control deck as a one-off, but not much more than that. But it still has devastating power as it is essentially unfair stamp on a supporter with a prize condition, which is why we will miss it. Number 10 is Roseanne's Backup. Choose one or more. Shuffle a Pokemon tool, a stadium, and or an energy card into your deck from your discard pile. This kind of recovery is absurd, especially for tools and stadiums. And upon a Pokemon being KO'd with a tool attached, the control player can return to the deck whatever is needed to keep controlling, which is why we will miss it. Number 10 is Team Yell's Cheer. Shuffle up to 3 in any combination of Pokemon and supporter cards, except for Team Yell's Cheer, from your discard pile into your deck. This card is wildly popular in block Snorlax decks, or those relying almost exclusively on supporter cards for their controlling compared to focusing on Pokemon's attacks or abilities. It is niche in that regard, but coupled with a few other cards like Palpad, this card would prevent deck out, keeping the control player in the game, which is why we will miss it. Number 7 is Collapse Stadium. Each player can't have more than 4 benched Pokemon, and if they do, they have to discard one. It's a form of bench control, and for the control player, this stadium is responsible for taking unnecessary supporter Pokemon off the bench, as they are prize liabilities, as well as encouraging or forcing your opponent to remove an attacking Pokemon from theirs, which is why we will miss it. Number 6 is Temple of Sinnoh. All special energy attached to Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's, provide only a single colorless energy. So DTE would just be made into a single colorless energy and has no other effect. As much as it could hurt the control player, this card was more about slowing down the special effects of opponent's cards, like Neo Upper Energy, Legacy Energy, or anything Lugia V-Star was running at the time. It's found in decks wanting to counter those specific matchups known for their special energies, which is why we will miss it. Number 5 is Hisuian Heavy Ball. Look at your face down prize cards, reveal a basic Pokemon you find there, put it into your hand, and put Hisuian Heavy Ball in its place. A card popular in all kinds of decks. For the control player, this meant finding that one basic Pokemon necessary for setting up the board, which is why we will miss it. Number 4 is Lost Vacuum. You can use this card only if you put one of your cards from your hand into the Lost Zone. Choose a Pokemon tool attached to any Pokemon or a stadium in play and put it in the Lost Zone. This item card is found as a one-off, sometimes two of, in any number of decks. Is there a Hero's Cape ruining your day? Lost Vacuum it! Is there a Pokestop crucial for your opponent's gaining card advantage? Lost Vacuum it! This card is extremely versatile and only requires a minor sacrifice on the user's part, which is why we will miss it. Number 3 is the notorious Miss Fortune Sisters. Look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck and discard any item cards you find there. This card's power cannot be underestimated, ladies and gentlemen. Item cards are crucial for practically any deck to get set up and running, and the fact that this deck can just discard them is extremely powerful. This card can discard them is extremely powerful. A staple to all sorts of control-style decks, Miss Fortune Sisters provided an opportunity to ensure victory by milling out your opponent's last few cards in the endgame. Early to mid-game, however, it made life extremely difficult when one could get rid of crucial setup cards like Rare Candy for Charizard or Nest Ball for big basics. Whatever the case, Miss Fortune Sisters gives the control player that extra edge necessary for win conditions to come to fruition, which is why we will miss it. Number 2 is Silene. Flip 2 coins, put a number of cards up to the number of heads from your discard pile on top of your deck in any order. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, like the Miss Fortune Sisters, this supporter's power cannot be underestimated. At first used only in block Snorlax decks, it slowly found its way into numerous control builds, notably Pidgeot Control and as a one-off elsewhere. Combined with Palpad and Team Yell's Cheer alluded to earlier, this card is responsible for preventing deck out. And what I meant by alluding to earlier is how it exactly works. First, you use Palpad to recover a supporter of your choice, and it goes into the discard pile. Then you place Silene and hopefully flip at least one heads. You recover Palpad, put it onto the top of your deck, you would draw it next turn, and thereby you could recover Silene over again and then repeat the process. You can also insert Team Yell's Cheer in there to recover Silene and try again. The point is, in getting back any card on top of your deck rather than the shuffling in of Roseanne's backup gives the player immediate access to a potential game-changing play, especially if the player can draw it right away with something like Bibarel, which is why we will miss it very dearly. And if you didn't already guess, ladies and gentlemen, the number 1 position goes to Forest Seal Stone. This Pokemon tool can get you any card in the deck once per game when this card is attached to a Pokemon V. It can allow you to break the game wide open. From rare candies for evolving into Pidgeot EX to boss's orders for game, the Forest Sealstone made it all possible and is responsible for countless control wins, which is why we will miss it. So now let's get into the Pokemon we will miss most, starting with honorable mentions. Jinx from Lost Origin. For 2 colorless energy, Alluring Dance will switch in one of your opponent's benched Pokemon, and it will make it confused. This card was popular in Ditto control and as an alternative to gusting options like Boss's Orders, so that another supporter could be used for turn instead. Ralts. For 1 psychic energy, it does 10 base damage. Choose one of your opponent's active Pokemon's attacks. During your opponent's next turn, that Pokemon can't use that attack. This card immediately shut down any attacking Pokemon with only a single attack, or a larger powerful attack, forcing the opponent to use the weaker one, or expend a resource to switch out of the active. Radiant Venusaur has the Sunny Bloom ability. Once at the end of your turn after you attack, you can use this ability, draw cards until you have 4 in your hand, and we ignore the attack. This card was an alternative draw engine for decks with low hand sizes, though its trap ability via Gust was something to be wary of. Next is Radiant Serena. The Elegant Heal Elegant Heal ability says once during your turn, you may heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. This healing card was found sporadically in all kinds of decks, especially ones with cards like the aforementioned Ralts, which could be KO'd quite easily. And last but not least is the Radiant Jirachi card with the ability Entrusted Wishes. If this Pokemon is in the active spot and is KO'd via damage, you search your deck for any 3 cards. And the attack Astral Misfortune for 2 colorless energy states to flip 2 coins, and if both are heads, your opponent's active Pokemon is KO'd. This card might be meme level, but at the same time, getting 3 cards just being KO'd was extremely valuable in turning the game around. Again, it's not control per se, but it would be very helpful in control decks to force the opponent to think twice about attacking. I know it did for me, lest the ability is activated, and so it acted as a kind of stall card. It could also be used as a last-ditch effort to KO a huge Stage 2 Pokemon you're having trouble controlling. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with the list proper at number 15 with Spinda. This card was mostly used as a one-off in various toolbox decks, especially more recently in Froslass Spread Control, as a stall card or to encourage those damage counter spread KOs. And what I mean is, its dizzying spin attack was 1 colorless energy, doing 10 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon on the board, and also confusing the active. I've also encountered as a quads meme deck, and it is absolutely infuriating to play against. It's great for getting what is sometimes necessary damage counter on your opponent's Pokemon in order to activate your own Pokemon's abilities or attacks. The low-cost instant confusion to stall out and frustrate your opponent, however, is why we will miss it. Number 14 is Ursaluna. Ignore the second attack. Pete Hunt has an attack cost of 1 colorless energy. Put up to 2 cards from your discard pile into your hand. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Like Silene, it's any 2 cards, but it goes right into your hand. This card is here partly because it's one of my personal favorites, but I otherwise included it because when it gets going, it is near impossible to defeat. Recovering any energy locking cards like Crushing Hammer or healing cards like Sharon's Care are 2 ways to play this archetype, and when new players get a hang of how the deck works, it becomes a lot of fun because of all the loops, which is why we will miss it. Number 13 is Alolan Vulpix V-Star. Ignore the second attack. Snow Mirage for 160 base damage and 2 colorless and 1 water energy states, this attack's damage is not affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from Pokemon that have an ability. This card won't be missed as much as it could be because of Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX having the same effect on an ability, which makes it easier to use, but it was a powerhouse at one time winning EUIC 2023 and was featured in all sorts of top tournament placements alongside Arceus V-Star. It struck terror in the eyes of all ability attacking players, which is why we will miss it. Number 12 is Mantine. The Born Ashore attack costs 1 colorless energy, and it states to put a basic Pokemon from either player's discard pile onto that player's bench. Mantine took the place of the E-Block item card Echoing Horn, which did the exact same thing. This card was popular in block Snorlax decks for a time because opponents who knew how to combat that archetype would discard their basics in fear of Erica's invitation, but Mantine would bring them back, allowing the control player to gust something useless into the active and retreat lock it, thus ensuring victory, which is why we will miss it. Number 11 is Ditto. It has the ability Sudden Transformation. This Pokemon can use the attacks of any basic Pokemon in your discard pile, except for Pokemon with a rule box, and you still need the necessary energy to use each attack. We've spoken of Ditto Control before, and this is the card we mean. Ditto typically has these kinds of copy attacks throughout its existence in the TCG, and Ditto Control was a thing at one point in the past, but it hasn't made much of a comeback in any number of recent formats, though there are plenty of cards to play with it. We featured the deck in one of the Control Classics rework videos in case anyone is interested. Cards like the Jinx and Ralts mentioned previously are part and parcel of this archetype's library, on top of many others, and its flexibility and diversity of attackers is why we will miss it. Speaking of diverse attackers for Ditto, number 10 is Lost Origin Bouffalant. For 3 colorless energy, Lost Headbutt does 50 base damage. Put an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon in the Lost Zone. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of merely discarding your opponent's energy, you remove it from the game entirely. This card was also featured in Pidgeot Control and numerous Toolbox Control decks thereof. It's guaranteed to take an opponent's energy out of the game, is why we will miss it. Number 9 is an attacking Pokemon, Radiant Charizard. This attacker is a finisher for control decks. Your opponents reduce themselves to 2 prizes and you bring up Charizard and take a KO because its Excited Heart ability says that this Pokemon's attacks cost 1 colorless less for each prize card your opponent has taken. So if they take 4 prizes, for 1 Fire Energy, Combustion Blast will do 250 base damage. Due to cards like Super Rod, if your Charizard is returned KO'd, you can shuffle it back into your deck and find it via search, maybe through Forest Sealstone. A quintessential card for a number of control decks that has since been replaced by Blood and Ursaluna EX, its vast power as a bodyguard, so to speak, for control decks is why we will miss it. Number 8 is Lumineon V. Ignore the attack. Luminous Sign ability states that when you put this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you can search your deck for any supporter card, reveal it, and then shuffle your deck. This card is a reprint of several predecessors. It's a good old reliable card that just gets you what you need. Is your hand empty? Get a Professor's Research. Is your opponent threatening with an unplayed revealed card? Get an Iono. It becomes a bench liability, but that's why Collapse Stadium and Penny are played alongside it. For its game-changing ability, we will miss it. Number 7 is Regieleki. Regieleki is everyone's favorite trainer retrieval card. There is a Dedenne replacing it, but with the lower 70 HP, although that card does have a 1 colorless retreat cost. Anyway, Electromagnetic Sonar for 1 colorless energy states to put a trainer card from your discard pile into your hand. It's a staple in both Ditto and Pidgeot control decks now, and Regieleki can torment your opponent by oppressing them with the same card turn after turn after turn, which is why we will miss it. Number 6 is Pidgeot V. Ignore the attack. The ability Vanishing Wing states, once during your turn, if this Pokemon is on your bench, you may shuffle it and all attached cards into your deck. This card is the only one of its kind in the history of the Pokemon TCG, as it is made to prevent deck out. Putting this card in your deck, specifically with Hisui and Heavy Ball, ensured that unless your opponent milled you without recovery, you weren't losing because of card loss. It gave you permission to freely expend yourself however you pleased to act towards your deck's goal. Just keep a bench slot open and you're set, which is why we will miss it. One archetype that has especially enjoyed using Pidgeot V is number 5, Block Snorlax. Ignore the attack. The ability is block. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's active Pokemon can't retreat. One of the most dreaded archetypes of all time, this card single-handedly caused more rage than few other control decks in the history of the Pokemon TCG. You put 4 Block Snorlaxes into your deck, put one of them in the active, and try to get something of your opponent's from the bench into the active, if it's not already in the active, and just force it to sit there, something that can't attack, like a Lumineon V. And then you just use your supporters and a draw engine of your choosing to get resources and use it to manipulate your opponent's board state. This archetype utilized in droves any number of the cards on these 2 lists because it just wanted to prevent retreat and play supporters. With a very easy setup, these are the reasons why we will miss it. But you respond to me. Now, Dr. Red, what on earth could control players miss more than Block Snorlax? Well, young grasshopper, what about number 4, Mawile? Tempting Trap for 1 colorless energy. During your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon can't retreat. Ignore the rest of the card. One of the weaknesses of Block Snorlax is that it is possible to gust around, because the retreat lock only activates when Snorlax is in the active. Mawile, however, does not work that way. Because it's the effect of an attack, it stays on your opponent's active Pokemon, even if your opponent moves a benched Pokemon of yours to the active spot. It's not an archetype in and of itself, but it finds itself in all kinds of decks as a last-minute win condition. If nothing else works, I'll just use Mawile to trap something after my opponents expend all of their resources. There is a replacement to this card in the new Wellspring Mask Ogerpon EX, but its attack does 20 damage, and with double turbo energy leaving, you will eventually KO your opponent's Pokemon. As for the ease of attack and an almost practical assurance of victory, we will miss it. It's the same situation with this next Pokemon, but its attack effect is much different. Number 3 is Luxray V. Ignore the second attack. Fang Snipe does 30 base damage for 2 colorless energy. Your opponent reveals their hand. Discard a trainer card you find there. It's the opposite of Regieleki. You can discard anything your opponent needs to advance their agenda, rather than recover it. Do you see Boss's Orders? Discard it. They can't get Luxray V out of the active via a Gust. Do they have Super Rod to recover much needed energies? Discard it. Do they have Palpad to recover a much needed supporter later on? Discard it. The control player can single-handedly win an entire match with just this one card discarding turn after turn after turn, which is why we will miss it. Number 2 is Manaphy. The wave availability prevents all damage done to your benched Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. A one-of card in countless decks, pretty much all of them, Manaphy just makes your playing easier. Whatever your archetype is afraid of, put Manaphy on the bench and rest easy, which is why we will miss it. And number 1 is, ladies and gentlemen, as you might expect, Rotom V. Ignore the attack. The ability Instant Charge states, once during your turn you may draw 3 cards. If you use this ability, your turn ends. Yes, it is a prize liability, but it's mitigated with Penny and Collapse Stadium. This card is responsible for early game setup, and without it, some control decks may never even get off the ground because they can't live off of top deck mode. It also allows you to draw when you are unable to attack, or if you're a non-attacking deck, you simply choose not to. It's also a Pokemon that can use Forest Sealstone. So you can attach Forest Sealstone, get the card you need, do what you have to do, and then draw 3. And you are all of a sudden 3 to 4 cards deeper into your deck. And for all of these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we will miss it. Good riddance, Rotom V. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. What did I miss? Where am I wrong? Apologies for the mispronunciations. Please leave a comment. Take care of yourselves, and may God hold you in the palm of his hand.